Meredith, thank you for joining us for this discussion on your trip to India. I'm going to go straight to it and start with AI. There's a great deal of concern uh, around the world that there is a race to dominate AI and essentially take a leadership role in the so-called fourth industrial revolution. India is one country where we're trying to let's say, look at ideas such as non-personal data and making uh, data sets publicly available. Our data protection bill removes privacy protections from publicly available personal data. And the idea is that more data means better AI, and countries need to do that to get ahead. What's your take on this thinking?
Well, I'll start by just laying out my view and then get into my analysis and why I have that view. Um, AI is a marketing term. It is over 70 years old, and over its long history, it has been applied to a vast and disparate variety of technical methods. So it is more a signifier of aspiration that I would like to create something that I might view as human like or as, behaving in a human like way. And it has been a very good way at certain periods in history and certainly now to get funding and grants. So it is marketing, not a technical term of art. And I center that at the beginning of my answer because I think that with that view we can begin to unpack what AI is and who AI serves, right? Why are we focusing on it right now? And, to answer that question, I do what I generally do, which is I go back to history and I try to figure out how we got here. And if you look at, the history of AI and in combination with the history of the commercial internet and the growth of the tech industry that's built on, commercializing networked computation, particularly surveillance advertising as the economic engine of this, commercial endeavor, you begin to recognize sort of the role of AI at this moment, which is, these techniques, which we called machine learning until the early 2010s, have been around for a long time. The convolutional neural nets are a technology that was developed in the late 80s. There was, or an approach to machine learning that was developed in the late 80s. There were a number of, kind of minor upgrades. But the reason I assert that we never heard much about those until the early mid 2010s is because the resources required to make them profitable and interesting to the tech industry at large did not exist until then. And those resources are the collateral of the surveillance advertising business model. So they are massive amounts of computational power. So when you hear about GPUs and the rush to compute, that's what we're talking about. And I would point to a wonderful report that just came out of the AI Now Institute looking at the supply chains for compute and examining that in the context of AI. So on the one hand, you have compute, and on the other hand, you have data, which you mentioned. Sort of the more data, the better, the bigger the AI is the common sense wisdom at this moment. So what we can see is that AI, or this narrative of AI, which was sort of projected onto older machine learning techniques that were then applied to the resources of the data and compute concentration that these surveillance advertising monopolies had acquired by the early 2010s is really what's propelling that narrative now, and or propelling the AI hype cycle that kicked up around 2015 and died down maybe a little bit and then kicked up again when Microsoft released ChatGPT. And from that perspective, we need to recognize AI as a tool of centralized power and as a set of technologies that that at its most maximal, so this bigger is better style of AI or machine learning, can only be created by a handful of corporations that are based in the US and China as a rule, that have access to this computational power and these sort of massive amounts of data and the resources needed to curate that data, to collect and create new data, to sort of create the data pipelines needed to produce these technologies we're calling AI.
So I'm just curious about whether you're saying that there should be so without this centralization of power, without the monopoly power and the resources that they have and they've deployed, what we have today, which is being called AI, wouldn't exist, or it wouldn't be available. There are small businesses that are using these to automate their business processes. There are people who are using it for making their lives easier. So, would you say that you would rather not have this, or is there an alternative to the centralized, monopolized power controlling the future of AI as we have it?
Well, I think AI is a derivative of the surveillance business model, and I would rather not have the surveillance business model because the surveillance business model trends toward consolidation and has put inordinate control over our social and economic institutions in the hands of a handful of corporations, again, based in the US and China generally.
So, what do you think of open sourcing AI tools? Meta's claim that it has open sourced its libraries, its large language models, and that's being seen as one way of addressing the power of or the dominance now of ChatGPT and Google and Bard. Um, so, what do you think of firstly them doing this, and secondly, do you see open sourcing AI as a mechanism for addressing dominance, where anyone can set it up on their home computer as well?
I love this question because I just published a paper on this along with Sarah Myers West and David Witter, um, which was actually driven by my need to answer this question because, as you among few are very aware, open source AI has become a kind of micro trend within the AI hype cycle with a lot of claims made about what it does and does not do. Um, and when we dug under the surface of this question, what became very evident was that, there's, of course, a vast difference between open source software, which is where we import the values and the ideologies and the kind of affordances of what we think of when we think of open source, and AI systems, which are modular, they are complex, they are dependent on vast resources and labor forces to create and deploy. So what we cannot assume that these are two fungible things, software and AI, but the narrative around open source has often very lazily or even I think intentionally misrepresented open source AI as simply replicating the values and features of open source software. But AI, we break this down in the paper, but to create these large AI models, which is the sort of current trendiest form of so-called artificial intelligence, you need, as we discussed, these massive compute infrastructures. Those are not open. Those are extremely expensive. It's $100 million is one sort of estimate for one training run of GPT-4. So this is, this $100 million is not open, right? We don't just find that laying around and then the good Samaritans of the open source movement go get to work to volunteer to create a model. So this is an extremely scarce and expensive resource to the point where we have OpenAI itself scrambling to get more GPUs, right? Scrambling to get more compute, because even it can't get enough to satisfy the voracious bigger is better paradigm right now. You then have data. And there are some very well curated open data sets. I would point to the Pile, which was created by the nonprofit Eleuther AI, which is really trying to do maximally open AI. But again, they create this data set. It is one of the most commonly used open data sets that anyone can kind of download and make use of. But it's not it's not ready for use, right? To actually get the data into a shape that can be used to train and inform a workable model that you could commercialize, it takes a lot of labor. You have to curate that. You often combine it with other data sets. You do, a lot of testing. So again, that may be open, but you need a lot of specialized labor. And it's not just like pulling a library off the shelf for, some software package. You then need to make these systems useful within the context of our daily sort of social and economic lives. So, there's a term that was made up recently, and it's one of those terms that tries to, in my view, add a patina of technical jargon to something that is actually not very technical. So it's reinforcement learning with human feedback loop, or RLHF, right? And that acronym gets thrown around, and you're like, oh, well, that's a technical term, right? That's some development process. What it really means is that very low paid workers, often in Kenya through a company called Sama, are contracted to these large AI companies like OpenAI. And those workers have to instruct and sort of, train the system to not produce, or not reproduce some of the ugliest parts of the internet, right? The web data that it's trained on. So this is, hate speech, racism, the most horrible things you can think of, watching, feeding in, descriptions of, I don't even want to say a description of what it is because it makes me so uncomfortable, some of these things, or it sort of evokes such ugly imagery. So, you have people who are sort of the human buffers to calibrate these systems so that these systems can behave, within the parameters of polite business liberalism, right? Like you can't be just spitting out racism and have this system be kind of deployed in a production environment. And that process is extremely expensive. Even though these laborers themselves are paid very little, you need many of them, and it's a very resource intensive process to give them instructions for how they do this, to give them, kind of, continue that sort of high touch process. So again, that is not open. You then get to the AI model itself, and yes, you can, put out a software package of the trained model, and people can pull that off the shelf and run it. That is open, and you can license that under a very permissive license, so in an Apache 2, or you can do what Facebook did with Llama 2, which is just make up their own license, but claim that it's open within this context of a very vague and ill-defined sort of concept of open AI. So they're sort of weaponizing that way. But I think that the final thought here, as we sort of break down these modular components, is to speak about the that is just the phone in my hotel room ringing. So viewer join my life for a moment. Anyway, so the final point I want to make here is that the in order to use that model, which you can fine tune, which you can sort of extend, you need huge amounts of resources. So it's very expensive to run a large AI model, much more expensive than just sort of, deploying a software package, right? And there is, we don't have great numbers around this because again, these companies are proprietary. They don't share everything we need to know with us. But one estimate, estimates that the cost of running ChatGPT, the Microsoft advertisement for its Azure GPT AI APIs, is, as much as a GPT-4 training run every week. So again, that may be technically open, like it's under Apache 2, I can use it, but the resources required to actually make use of it are, in every practical sense of the term, closed.
So there are, like you said, in the process of training, some amount of protections that are built in, but we've also seen that, for example, ChatGPT itself was jailbroken at some point in time, and protections removed. Now, there's also this concern that we hear often that as we near AGI, things are going to become trickier. And Sam Altman's called for the UN to look at creating regulations around usage of AI. Firstly, what do you think the risks are? And secondly, do you think regulation should be at a UN level globally for AI?
I mean, it's funny, you work in tech policy for years. You're one of the people who probably has some of the most knowledge in the world over how tech policy has evolved in time with the tech industry. like imagine thinking the UN is a regulatory body, right? So
Yeah.
like that, that's where we're starting, right? Um, um,
So
I think
I would say that you would ask for the UN to regulate something when you don't want there to be any regulation.
yes, exactly. That is also but also when you want to make it sound sort of grand and global and in need of a wise man's counsel, right? Which is again part of the narrative of like AGI, like this is bigger than anything, so we need regulation that is bigger than anything. We need the world to come together and focus on my projects because my project will create AGI, which is again a sort of is a religious concept, not a technical concept, but it's certainly good at grabbing the imagination and particularly it's sort of like catnip to a certain you know old men politicians, frankly. So I think it's a very effective narrative strategy to sort of warp the debate, but I don't think it's what we're talking about is an attempt to skirt the type of regulation that could chill this business model in the present so that it can entrench itself, you know and then in 10 years there's no way we're going to be able to sort of root this out of our infrastructures, our daily lives, our decision making processes, the way we the way we kind of assume the world works. And so I think the danger from AI is that it is giving extraordinarily control, often unchecked control, to a handful of corporations that are ultimately driven by a desire to increase revenue and growth forever and always. And that those goals are not always aligned with the social good, and that the power dynamics of AI, which will be used by these corporations in their self-interests, and will, often will also be used by institutions and governments that have the resources to license that AI, whether it be to monitor workers or to, surveil refugees at the borders or to equip police with more surveillance and assessment tools. That what we're looking at is a tool that is ultimately a tool of those in power that will be used to further surveil, oppress, and shape the lives of those they have power over across the board. So that's the danger I see. I have no belief in AGI. I think that's a fairy tale, and fairy tales are very exciting, but they're not real.
So just connecting two of your worlds together, what do you think? Um, the level of AI, to use that phrase, and the rapid increase in processing power means for cryptography, privacy, and cybersecurity.
Well, I think, just at the sort of most basic level, AI is a surveillance technology. It requires surveillance data, or, it requires the entrenchment of the surveillance business model. It calls into being an expansion of that business model. If AI is going to, be generally intelligent, it needs to know everything. And where does that
Mhm.
knowledge come from? It comes from data that is created or constructed by different entities to answer questions about various things. It comes from surveillance of people. It comes from our Flickr accounts. It comes from our Instagram accounts. It comes from all of these surfaces on which data about us is either constructed or sort of created by us. So it is diametrically opposed to data protection, data minimization, and a lot of the privacy, legislation that many of us have been sort of pushing for, because it requires this data, and it is you already see AI being used as a justification to sort of share more data, collect more data, liberalize these sort of the kind of walls between data silos, or liberalize access to data and break down those walls, etc. AI is also a surveillance technology in that it is used to make predictions and assessments about people, populations, environments in ways that give control to those with access to that information over those about who that information represents. So it doesn't matter that the data about me produced by an AI system is wrong or right. What matters is that it constitutes something that can shape my access, shape my future, shape my place in the world. So I think we need to recognize that those surveillance, cybersecurity, cybersecurity is sort of related, but the surveillance, privacy, those AI is kind of at the core of those issues, and it is in fact opposed to a world where we have more privacy and more digital rights. I think in cybersecurity, AI is just, I think there are a lot of, I think the safety debate is sort of skirting some of the, they're calling again, viewer. The AI debate is kind of skirting some of the really, or the AI hype, and the safety debate is skirting some of the very real vulnerabilities with these systems, which you see in some of the adversarial research. You see in the fact that these systems cannot help but replicate the social inequalities that are encoded in the data they're trained on. So whether we call this bias, whether we call this sort of a reflection of, the inequality and racialization, there is no way to make AI not a reflection of our world as it is. And there's a huge danger that we mistake that reflection for sort of an objective projection. This is not the world as it is and as it should be, kind of, and a world we can change. This is the world as it should be. This is the world as computation sees it. This is the world as it should be ordered. So
on the privacy side of things, at Signal, you're just coming off a battle to protect end-to-end encryption in the UK. How has that battle turned out? Was there a victory? Because it looks like that the text of the law still remains as is, but there was seemingly some assurance given in Parliament. Where do we stand on that debate? Right?
yeah, I mean, I think you know the push to minimize or eliminate or get an end run around encryption is not new, and I doubt it's going away. Um, the debate in the UK is sort of a very fierce instance of that wish, and in which there's a very there's a large kind of an omnibus bill that has been going through the UK's political process for many years. There is a clause in that bill, clause 122, that would give their telecom and competition regulator the power to mandate accredited technology, a very vague term that ultimately points to client-side scanning, in order to scan the content of everyone's messages to detect prohibited expression effectively. So this is a alarming step back in terms of privacy and step forward in terms of creating an illiberal surveillance state, particularly in the context of a self-professed liberal democracy. And so, of course, we fought that because there is no way to safely and privately scan the contents of end-to-end encrypted messaging. Anyone who understands these technologies will, look at that sentence with, a little perplexed, like you must have mistaken something, because we all know this is not, the properties of end-to-end encryption is that only the ends, only, Nikhil and Meredith can actually see what we are saying to each other. That's the privacy guarantee encoded in the math that we use to ensure encrypt this conversation. What are you talking about? Kind of scanning all of those messages in some way that would detect prohibited expression. So the law, this is not the only law of this kind, so I'm sort of belaboring the kind of terms of that law, because this is, as with much tech policy, there are sort of global trends and memes that pop up, and this is one. The idea that you can create an AI technology that can sort of somehow magically undermine but not undermine end-to-end encryption. So the law moved forward. There was, incredible pressure from the Home Office, the security services, and from a, coalition of, I think some well-meaning child advocacy groups and some AI companies dressed up like child advocacy groups who are looking for those contracts to sell client-side scanning to the government as accredited technology, that has made this a bit more complicated. But the law moved forward, but we were able by the end to get an assurance, or to get the government on the record in Parliament acknowledging that the technology that could, do this scanning for end-to-end encryption does not exist, which is a fairly significant statement given the vendor pressures and the sort of hype and snake oil that's being sold by those AI companies. And we were also, we didn't do this, but I think the environment was created such that Apple was able to weigh in and say that, we are, one of the most powerful, well-resourced companies on earth. We have some of the best cryptographers and software engineers on earth. We tried to build such a system, and now we're coming out publicly and categorically and saying it's not possible. So, I think we were able to, if I'm going to put it in the shorthand, we won the narrative argument, right? By the end, it was very, very clear that, there was on one side sort of, the aspirations of the security services, which have never changed. They, or the law enforcement has always wanted to undermine end-to-end encryption, the law enforcement aspirations and, kind of AI hype. And on the other hand, there was a long-standing technical consensus that this is, backdoors are simply, dangerous, and you cannot put a backdoor into end encryption and consider it private. So, we the like these law do's is now, the vague terms of this clause are now being turfed to the regulator. The regulator has to create an enforcement framework. It's going to be a very long process, but we will continue pushing on Ofcom, the regulator, to make clear publicly that they will not leverage this, this power to, fundamentally undermine private communications infrastructure in the UK in a way that would redound to the world at large.
This is a never-ending battle between technology and law, right? And what we're seeing now, by the looks of it, looking at what's happened in the UK, what's happened in India, is that the lawmakers are pushing the law as it is, and saying that solving the technology problem is your problem, not ours. We've made the law now, and you can't overrule the law of the land in a sense. Are you fighting unwinnable battles here? In that sense, like is it possible for technology to prevent what the law has enforced and still survive? In the sense that I don't know where this ends, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, no battle is winnable if you don't try to fight. So I don't, the history is I think there's an invitation here, right? Like we can't just stand back behind a Cartesian window and, pontificate on how we think the world will turn out. We are agents of history, and we can continue to push to make the world, safe for a livable future. I think the stakes of this are so high, and I think it's always difficult, and I've never found the right way to kind of connect the like beating heart of these issues, the like humanity of these issues. Like this is, without signal, without, the ability to have privacy. And I'm not saying digital privacy. I don't think there's a difference at this moment in history between digital privacy and some other form of like embodied privacy. We're talking about, they've collapsed. We're surveilled in the streets, we're surveilled in school, we're surveilled at work. And, if we don't have a place where we can be honest with each other, where we can have intimate conversations, where we can express things that we think are wrong, we're not going to be able to organize. We're not going to be able to, make the dramatic shifts that are necessary to, at least reduce the harm of climate collapse. We're not going to be able to, create and recreate our world democratically. So, I will keep fighting these battles. I don't fight them because I have a little calculator that says I think they're winnable and this will be a good career move, right? Like I fight them because I think they're existential, and I don't think there's another choice if I want to be able to wake up in the morning with dignity.
Uh, what's the argument against end-to-end encryption that you found the hardest to counter? What is it that people really don't get, either from a societal perspective or from a technology perspective?
This is not, there's two I'm going to name. And the first is, I don't think actually an argument against end-to-end encryption. It is kind of a powerful narrative that gets thrown up as a pretext to argue against it. So, and this is the, the long-standing pattern. And this goes back to, the first instance of this I found was Stuart Baker in 1993 in an op-ed in Wired. And Stuart Baker was the head of the NSA. And he has an op-ed in Wired that is defending key escrow and the Clipper chip. So, he's like, encryption's okay, but we need a backdoor, right? And the Clipper chip was for those, Wikipedia, it is one of the canonical crypto wars that sort of started the first crypto war. But in this op-ed, he is sort of, makes the claim at that early date that PGP, sort of the end-to-end encryption for email, is, a tool for pedophiles. And so, already the specters that get thrown up to scare us away from end-to-end encryption, to, by association, affiliate end-to-end encryption with the bad guys, the worst people, the demons, the monsters, are very, very emotionally powerful. Like, we do not want pedophiles in our world. We hate them. I feel that, like right now talking about that. But, then if you are defending the right to privacy, you get, there's a sort of a way that a story about the people you are keeping private substitutes for a meaningful argument against end-to-end encryption, and actually works to sort of, compel people to associate encryption with bad guys and to argue against it. So I don't think this is an actual argument. I think this is sort of an emotional smokescreen that is incredibly powerful, that end-to-end encryption protects pedophiles, it protects the worst people in the world. And if you defend it, you are in favor of the worst people in the world. And that makes it also very unpleasant to, go in there and argue, because, to the second point, the other kind of misunderstanding is that this is a sort of, it's not a technology you can compromise on, right? It is not it's not, it's, there's only a handful of like robust crypto systems, and we all use them because it's very easy to get it wrong, and very hard to get it right. And so the Signal protocol is one of those handful of crypto systems that has been proven robust. But if you undermine that, we actually undermine fundamentally the ability of anyone to have privacy at all, because we don't have many of these. And because if we're going to go into our garage and do like DIY cryptographer, we're almost certainly going to mess it up, and there will be an exploit in there somewhere. So, what you see even in like the way my answer is divided is, like, on the one hand, an incredibly emotionally compelling story, right? One that, like, there is no human alive, whatever they think about encryption, that isn't sort of like, like their heart doesn't react to that and they feel it, right? That's powerful. And then on the other hand, there's these like weird little nuances that you just have to trust me on, like relating to mathematics and the way these like, arcane little systems work, that I'm just like, you can't touch them, right? And it's a bit like counterbalance, there's no symmetry there. Like, one is not that interesting to lay people, and they're used to tech being like full of nonsense and not quite believing in it, and that's not something I understand. And the other is something that will grip any human being who's able to listen. So I think there is there's a real, we're always, we're kind of on the back foot when we have to go in and argue math versus the specter of endangered children, even if I believe that what we're talking about is a really often using these emotional narratives as a pretext to fulfill a longstanding wish by law enforcement to have omniscient power to view everyone, and to eliminate encryption to do it.
Is there any means of having client-side scanning or some kind of a mechanism for accessing messages on device that is feasible with a messaging app, to highlight some of these issues or to identify some of these issues? And I'm just speaking from a purely like from what law enforcement agencies demand.
So there is no way to implement client-side scanning that sends the information demanded to law enforcement or a third party safely and privately. So no, there is no technology there. You can do, on device, you can have a software. I'm trying to put like a nuanced point in layperson's terms, so bear with me. But like, you can have a software package that talks to itself and sort of, maybe uses some on-device technology. But the issue is that the second you insert kind of a third party into an end-to-end relationship, you have created an exploit.
Hmm.
And it doesn't, like even Apple's, sort of Apple proposed a system like that would, use, had various, both procedural and technological kind of safeguards. Like it would have to scan, but it would, have to detect like n number of scans before it would actually flag those scans to workers that would then review, kind of decrypt and review those scans. But somebody somewhere, that there is a database involved that could be, easily hacked. There is the issue of, you have a third party in there, so government pressure. Like, we know Apple rolled for China, so why wouldn't they roll for, like we need you to add an image to your hash database of our political opposition. We want to understand who's sharing this image and get a sense of that. And then we'll have our security services in your office reviewing those, right? And that, that may seem far-fetched, but it's not far-fetched given how much power these systems have and how motivated a lot of these states are, to make use of them. So, I think the issue here, this is not a technical problem to solve technologically, right? It is it is really a problem of how, this type of power asymmetry operates in the context of the possibility of, surveillance information asymmetry. So, Apple is, a for-profit company. We saw how they acted in China. How much leverage would you need to sort of leverage that system? And that doesn't even touch the fact that these machine learning based detection systems are easily gamed, right? One of the things that happened when Apple, kind of publicized the, it's the client side scanning system that they've now disavowed, that they've now said, we can't do this safely and privately, was that people very quickly were able to access the model. I think they decompiled the client, got access to the model, and within, I believe, about 24 hours, but a very short period of time, were able to, find huge vulnerabilities in the system that allowed them to manufacture false positives or false negatives. So either hide an image that was in fact, should in fact be scanned under the, sort of rubric of the system, or, kind of make an image that was not, should not have been flagged, sort of, flagged by using kind of hash collisions, which is a property of how these machine learning systems work, not like a bug, right? And it hasn't been solved. So, I get into the technical details there, but the real issue is like, you cannot build a client side scanning system where you're sort of sending information out to third parties about, everyone's communications based on sort of a list of what communications to scan for that has been enumerated, behind our backs without any, auditability, and like consider that anything other than a backdoor that breaks end-to-end encrypted messaging. And I think, I'll just I'll add on to this. I think in some sense, the fact that this has been an argument that has been turfed to the technical community and seen as a technical problem has done us a big disservice, because this has led to attempts to kind of solve breaking end-to-end encryption through client-side scanning technologically, when in fact, again, this is not something that technology can solve. It's about power dynamics.
From a technology perspective, one of the demands has been that they should, if it's possible, to introduce an identifier for the sender of a message, and then have that identifier included when it gets forwarded from person to person, so that the originator of the message is identified or is identifiable. Is that feasible with end-to-end encryption from a from a tech perspective?
No, it's not feasible with Signal, and you would have to make some pretty significant modification. You basically have to sort of add that feature on top, which would undermine, the deniability properties of end-to-end encryption.
So, because plausible deniability is built into the system.
Yes.
How does interoperability impact end-to-end encryption? Facebook's been talking about wanting to bring interoperability with end-to-end encryption between its multiple messaging mechanisms, whether WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, Instagram DMs. On, is it possible? Can this work?
Um, I think we could say it could work, but we need to use the subjunctive, because, I think everyone would need to be using the same standard. So, Facebook uses the Signal protocol to encrypt WhatsApp messages, Instagram DMs, or, they're going to be rolling it out on Messenger, but they're sort of testing that. So Messenger. And so, they, basically, if we all agreed to that standard, then we could all apply that standard and interoperate, right? The issue that is that we're dealing with unwilling actors with a lot of power. So, Apple doesn't want to interoperate per the standard that Facebook put forward. They want to, use their own standard, Google the same. And so I think, I think the DMA is going to be a long, hard process. And I would probably bet on it never happening, honestly. But that is like deep cynicism that comes from having been in too many standards bodies processes before. I think, so end-to-end encryption of the content of the messages, there are ways it could happen, right? But they're very hypothetical and they don't take into account the sort of interests of the different actors that are sort of expected to interoperate. They don't take into account the fact that, honestly, like you can write a specification, but if if your specification is missing things or the implementation you give is like shitty, it's not going to work. And there are so many ways it can like not work and so few ways it might work, and you would need kind of perfect cooperation. And again, we have unwilling actors here. So just, I think we need to look at the politics here. For Signal, we are not looking to interoperate with any of the gatekeepers under the DMA, in part because we encrypt our metadata. And it's very unclear to us how we would interoperate and maintain that, our high privacy bar for metadata, and that gets into sort of complexities like metadata is necessary for routing, it's necessary for other things. Before we even get to the question of sort of, which companies are fulfilling which law enforcement requests, right? What type of data would they give over? Is, Apple's policies commensurate with Meta's policies? Or would an Apple user be subjected to Meta's policies if they were sort of interoperating with a Facebook Messenger user? So this is freighted with so much complexity that I have seen almost no answers to. And sort of, for Signal, we're just sort of stepping back because, we're not expecting it to move forward that quickly.
How much control does Signal have over the deployment of the Signal protocol? Because you're encrypting metadata and you're collecting much less data, whereas WhatsApp is not.
Yeah. So our protocol is open source. So if anyone, we have an implementation online, you can, use it if you want. But in order to claim that you're using the Signal protocol to sort of, call it that, you need to license it from us. So we have some control in that, what we don't want is some shoddy implementation where it's just, to be kind of licensed under our name, because we're very, we recognize that security and privacy are things that are, we want to be responsible for everything that has our name on it, and we don't want people to be confused. And so, WhatsApp, Meta licenses it, Google licenses it, Twitter has licensed it, although I don't know if they're using it right now. I don't think so. So it's, it is the gold standard for messaging security. It sort of was a paradigm shift in 2013 when it was released. And, we continue to improve it as well. We just launched, our first phase of post-quantum resistance to the protocol. So it's now, that is now rolled out in production and will be rolling out to everyone in the next months. So, that is also, the kind of improvements we do are also licensable and usable open source.
Why don't we have more deployment of end-to-end encryption globally? What will it take? Is it a complexity issue? Is it a cost issue? Just like HTTPS is now a standard applied everywhere, why isn't end-to-end encryption in all forms of messaging and mails?
Well, I think because the business model of the tech industry is monetizing surveillance. And, let's remember, HTTPS wasn't rolled out until after Snowden, when the companies faced, or wasn't rolled out at the scale it is rolled out now, right? There wasn't a push for it until after Snowden, when the companies faced a massive blowback that threatened their trust, right? So I think, there isn't a structural incentive within the tech industry to prevent the collection of data. In fact, all of the norms and assumptions and unwritten rules are, structured around collecting as much data as possible. So there's, really we're facing an uphill battle because privacy is diametrically opposed to the engine of profit at the center of this industry.
But profit's not a bad word in the sense not everyone has access to donations like Signal. You have a guaranteed amount of funding from Brian Acton. So, what is Signal's approach to monetization, to surviving in the future? How do you make Signal sustainable on its own?
Yeah. Well, I mean, profit isn't a bad word unless the model, or the way that you kind of the engine generating profit is surveillance, in my view, right? Like that's the issue. I think, the reason there's only one Signal has a lot to do with this fact that, to have a business model in the tech industry, more or less, you're going to be monetizing surveillance or sort of selling services and infrastructure to those who do. So, Signal's model is unique. We hope we can, well, we don't hope. We believe, I'm confident that we can, move forward and make this work. But what we are, we're really pushing on getting, many, many small donations from a percent of the people who use us. So we have many millions of users. We are, luckily we have kind of a network effect and we have significant scale. And we want to be supported by the people who can afford to and who rely on us, because that's who we want to be accountable to. So we're really grateful that Brian sort of put in a lot of money that gave us an on-ramp. But let's be clear, it costs tens of millions of dollars a year just to sort of maintain and develop Signal, and that's a cost that's never going away. That's our server infrastructure, that is the registration cost, that is our bandwidth cost, that is our labor cost, and that's how much it costs to build high availability tech. And that's one of the reasons, and that's also a reflection on how profitable the surveillance business model is, right? Like that's, we're using these products for free, but that what's paying for that is the ability to monetize our data, the ability to sell us things, the ability, et cetera, to build AI models that, based on that data, et cetera, et cetera.
Last question, Meredith. Thank you for taking out so much time to speak with me. What what's your plan in terms of making Signal even more privacy preserving in the future? The mobile number is also a privacy vulnerability. It's being used as an identifier for many services. In fact, there are services in India that don't use anything but a mobile number as an identifier. So, what's your plan? One, you mentioned that quantum resistance or something on those lines. So, what all are you planning to do to make Signal more privacy preserving?
So I really like that you brought up the mobile number, because this is something we're actively working on now. And I just I want to say I appreciate all of the people, yourself and others outside of the United States who are in contexts that I'm less familiar with, sort of raising the issue of mobile numbers, and the deep link between mobile numbers and in some regions between that and sort of government identity, or at the fact that those are identifiers and very sensitive. And right now we are in the final stages of working on usernames. So usernames will allow you to connect with other people on Signal without sharing your number. And that means if your device is seized and someone is going through your groups or your contact lists, they won't be able to just enumerate all of the phone numbers and identify those people through mobile numbers. So you will still need to use a mobile number to register, but that mobile number can be kept invisible to anyone who touches your device or anyone who communicates with you. So that's one way we're working to raise the privacy bar. The other, you mentioned, and I mentioned earlier, is we just upgraded our encryption protocol to be resistant to a future to be resistant to quantum computer attacks, which there aren't sufficiently powerful quantum computers in existence right now, at least that we know of. But there are informed projections that assume that in 10 to 30 years, and it's a little bit foggy, but in the future we will have sufficiently powerful quantum computers that could break the encryption we're using now that works for classical computers. So what we did is upgrade it so that it will prevent those potential future attacks, and prevent anyone who is collecting signal encrypted data now from decrypting it later. So with this rollout, none of the conversations that are protected under our post-quantum protocol will be available. It will be possible to decrypt it even in a future with a sufficiently powerful quantum computer.
Meredith, thank you for fighting the good fight, and thank you for taking time out to speak with us. Really appreciate it.
I really appreciate it, Nikhil. Thank you so much for fighting the good fight for so many years here. And it's a real honor to get to talk to you. And thank you again.
Thank you.